The wound was crawling with maggots. 23rd of June 1945, a British field hospital near the Rhine River. Thomas Hayes knelt beside a stretcher and cut away the blood-soaked uniform of a 19-year-old German girl. When he peeled back the final layer of improvised bandages, he stopped breathing. The shrapnel wound stretched diagonally across her entire lower back. Days old, septic, alive with insects performing their grotesque work. The tissue around it was black, grey, green. She'd been walking around with this for nearly a week. She turned her head away, waiting for disgust, for hatred. Instead, he shouted for morphine, plasma, and the senior surgeon. What happened next would connect two people across the chasm of war for more than 50 years. This is the story of Corporal Thomas Hayes, a Jewish medic whose family fled Hamburg in 1937, and Greta Weber, a German anti-aircraft gunner pulled from an overrun battery at dawn. First, you'll discover how Thomas fought his own commanding officer to save an enemy combatant whilst British soldiers lay dying in the same tent. Then you'll hear what Greta whispered to him 3 weeks after the surgery, words that revealed just how deeply the war's poison had seeped into her mind. And finally, you'll understand why, for 50 years, Thomas received an unsigned postcard every June 23rd, and what those postcards said. This isn't a story about heroes and villains. It's about what happens when one exhausted medic decides that a 19-year-old girl, regardless of the uniform she wore, deserves to live. Late June 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 6 weeks, but the dying hadn't stopped. Captain Richard Norton took one look at Greta's wound and dismissed the case outright. She's beyond help. We're overwhelmed with our own men. Resources go to British combatants. She's the enemy. Thomas didn't move. He met Norton's eyes and said, quietly but firmly, that this girl had concealed a catastrophic injury for days. That level of will to live, he argued, superseded military protocol. Norton hesitated. Thomas didn't wait for permission. He administered the morphine himself, set up the intravenous line, and began cleaning the wound with his own gloved hands. For 4 hours they worked in tense silence. Norton and Thomas side by side, excising dead tissue, flushing the cavity with antiseptic, packing it with sulphur powder. Greta drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in German about fire, about burning. By 2 in the morning it was done. She'd lost significant muscle tissue. Her hip would never move quite right again, but she was alive. Thomas stayed at her bedside through the night, changing dressings, monitoring her pulse, offering sips of water. When dawn came, she opened her eyes. The terror was gone. In its place, a searching clarity. She whispered, "You touched it. The filth. The corruption." He smiled, exhausted. "Yes, and it didn't harm me." She began to weep, not from pain, from relief. Thomas took her hand and held it until she stopped trembling. If you're the kind of person who wants to hear stories like this, stories about the quiet moments of humanity that emerge even in the darkest circumstances, then you're exactly who we make these videos for. Every week, we explore the human side of history, the moments that don't make it into the textbooks, the decisions that reveal who we really are when everything else is stripped away. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, let me tell you what happened during those 3 weeks of recovery. Thomas dedicated every spare moment to Greta's care. He secured better rations for her, tinned meat, real bread, occasionally chocolate. He taught her English words. Thank you. Please. Better. The pain is gone. She repeated them carefully, her accent thick but determined. He told her about London, about his childhood. Harmless stories that had nothing to do with war. She, in turn, shared fragments of Hamburg before everything burned, before the ideology consumed her world. 3 weeks after the surgery, when the infection was finally contained, she asked for a mirror. Thomas handed it to her, knowing what was coming. She turned, lifted her hospital gown, and looked at the scar for the first time. It stretched across her lower back like a jagged canyon, brutal, undeniable, permanent. She waited for his reaction. for disgust, for him to look away. He met her gaze in the mirror's reflection. "That's not a mark of shame," he said. "That's survival. You should carry it with pride." Her hand trembled as she set the mirror down. You know what's remarkable? Most people never hear stories like this. They think about World War II in terms of battles and generals and political ideologies. But you're still here, which tells me you understand that history isn't just about the big moments, it's about the small decisions that define us. That's exactly why this channel exists. We're building a community that refuses to let these human stories disappear into footnotes. If that sounds like something you want to be part of, subscribe. Now, 3 weeks after that moment with the mirror, Greta said something that changed everything. Thomas was changing her dressings when she spoke. "You're Jewish." It wasn't a question. He nodded. "You, a Jewish man, saved the life of a German girl." Tears welled in her eyes. She began to speak, haltingly, about what they'd been told during the war. The propaganda, the certainty that Jewish people were inhuman, that they would commit unspeakable atrocities. Thomas listened. His expression remained calm. When she finished, he said simply, "Some people choose darkness, others choose good. Today, in this place, I chose good. My job is saving lives." The simplicity of it seemed to break something loose in her. He continued, visiting for another month. He brought her American comics translated into German, taught her English curse words that made them both laugh until their wounds ached. She taught him Bavarian slang in return. When phantom pain flared at night, he'd sit by her cot reading stories about British history, about London's architecture, about traditional food, anchoring her until she finally slept. One evening she asked him directly, "Why do you keep coming? Every single day?" Thomas paused. When he answered, his voice was quiet but certain. "When I first saw that wound, crawling with maggots, septic, killing you, the sickness I recognized wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. The ideology that tried to convince you that you were worthless, that you deserved to die unnoticed." He looked at her steadily. "I knew my duty was to affirm your humanity, to prove you were just a human being fighting to live. I needed to prove that to you, but I also needed to prove it to myself." She listened, and in her eyes something shifted. The shadow began to lift. We've talked about the surgery, about the recovery, about the moment Greta confronted what she'd been taught to believe, but we haven't yet reached the most important part of this story. Because what happened on the morning Greta was transferred away from that field hospital would echo for more than 50 years. Stay with me. The morning came when Greta was scheduled for transfer to a permanent prisoner hospital deep behind the lines. She made one final request. "May I hold your identification tags?" Thomas removed them from around his neck and placed them in her hand. Cold metal, physical proof of his identity, his service. She pressed them to her lips, a silent vow. When she handed them back, she said, "You touched the fire for me. I will remember it forever, not the pain, but the touch." Thomas watched the ambulance disappear down the dusty track, swallowed by a cloud of dust kicked up by the wheels. He never saw Greta Weber again, but the story doesn't end there. Because for the next 50 years, every single year, on the 23rd of June, a postcard arrived. Always mailed from Germany, always unsigned, always the same careful English sentence. The fire doesn't burn anymore. Year after year, 1946, 1950, 1965, 1973, 1989. 995. The postcards never stopped. Thomas kept every single one. He stored them in a small wooden box in his study. When his children asked about them, he'd tell the story, about the field hospital, about the wound, about the choice he made. His daughter later recalled, "He never spoke about the war much, but those postcards, those he talked about, he said they reminded him why he'd become a medic in the first place." The postcards continued through Thomas's career as a civilian doctor. through his retirement, through the birth of his grandchildren. In the early 1990s, the messages grew longer. One postcard read, "The fire doesn't burn anymore. Thank you for your touch. I have never forgotten the man who chose light over darkness in the hour of my deepest need." Another, a few years later, "I now teach my own children that the greatest heroes are those who save their enemies with a touch. They will inherit the knowledge of your name." Thomas never tried to find her, never wrote back. Some connections, he believed, were meant to exist exactly as they were, an annual reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, one decision to choose good could ripple forward through decades. The last postcard arrived in June 1996. Thomas was 74 years old. The message was different. "The fire doesn't burn anymore, and neither do I soon, but the memory of your hand will outlive us both. Thank you, Corporal Hayes. Thank you for proving that kindness is the only true victor in all wars." No postcard came in June 1997. Thomas placed the empty envelope in the wooden box anyway. Here's what those postcards represented: not just gratitude, not just memory. They represented a complete transformation of worldview. Greta Weber had been raised in a system that taught her to hate, to fear, to dehumanize anyone who didn't fit the ideology. And then a Jewish medic spent 4 hours removing dead tissue from her septic wound, sat by her bedside through the night, held her hand when she wept. The postcards were proof that indoctrination, no matter how deep, can be broken by a single act of genuine humanity. Thomas understood this. In a letter to his daughter written late in life, he wrote, "I don't know what became of Greta. I don't know if she had a happy life, if she struggled, if she found peace. But I know that for 50 years, on the same day every year, she sat down and wrote to me. That meant she carried forward something good, and perhaps she passed it to her children, and perhaps they'll pass it to theirs." He continued, "That's what I learned in that field hospital. Hatred is loud, it burns fast and hot. But kindness is quiet. It smoulders for decades. It outlasts everything else." The wooden box of postcards was donated to the Imperial War Museum after Thomas's death in 1998. They sit in the archives now, 51 postcards spanning half a century, each one unsigned, each one a testament to what happens when someone chooses to see a human being instead of an enemy. Researchers have tried to locate Greta Weber. German records from that period are incomplete. Anti-aircraft batteries near the Rhine River crossing were overrun in late June 1945, but personnel records were lost or destroyed. She remains anonymous, just as she intended, but her words survive. Let me take you back to that moment in the field hospital one more time. June the 23rd, 1945. Thomas kneeling beside a stretcher, staring at a wound that should have killed this girl days ago. He could have walked away. His commanding officer had already dismissed the case. British soldiers were dying in the same tent. Resources were scarce. She was the enemy. Every rational military calculation said, "Let her die." But Thomas didn't see a German soldier. He saw a 19-year-old girl who'd somehow survived for nearly a week with a septic wound, hiding her agony, clinging to life with a determination that defied comprehension. And he made a choice. Not because it was easy, not because it would be rewarded, not because anyone would remember. He made the choice because, in that moment, affirming her humanity was more important than following orders. 4 hours of surgery, 3 weeks of recovery, 1 month of daily visits, 50 years of postcards. That's the arithmetic of compassion. You spend hours, you receive decades. This story isn't really about Thomas Hayes and Greta Weber. It's about the decision we all face when confronted with someone we've been taught to see as other. Do we follow the ideology, the propaganda, the convenient hatred that makes it easier to turn away? Or do we kneel down, cut away the blood-soaked uniform and do the difficult, messy, exhausting work of saving a life? Thomas chose the latter, and that choice echoed for 50 years. Greta Weber carried that memory forward. She taught it to her children. And somewhere in Germany today, there are people who know the story of Corporal Thomas Hayes, the Jewish medic who touched the fire and didn't flinch. That's how kindness works. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It just smoulders quietly, decade after decade, outlasting everything else. The fire doesn't burn anymore, but the memory of the touch remains. If you made it this far, thank you. Seriously. Stories like this take significant time to research and produce, and they only exist because people like you actually watch them all the way through. If you want more stories that explore the human side of history, the moments that reveal who we truly are, then subscribe. And if you think this story deserves to reach more people, share this video. These stories matter. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals can choose light. I'll see you in the next one.